Ladies and gentlemen, we'll convene now at 2:15 for our next panel, Modernity and Islam. I'm Henry Schwartz, delighted to be here. Welcome to all of you. I'm not Doha faculty, but I am Georgetown faculty, so I'm exercising Georgetown privilege and taking the microphone. However, I will sit down very shortly and stop this nonsense. But I do think we need to get going, and evidently the Doha faculty have decided to have a faculty meeting at this point. And so they're not here with us in the room. So evidently, Professor Verhoeven has charged me with convening this session in the interest of time, since we have three distinguished panelists who will present to us, and we have to wrap up at some point this afternoon. So with no further ado, I will let the panelists introduce themselves, quite all right? And I will step down, and thank you for being here, and I wish us all a very rewarding session.
Thank you very much. My name is Abdulkader Tayob. I'm from the University of Cape Town in the Department of Religious Studies. So it's great to be here. It was really an interesting two panels this morning, and appreciate the opportunity to learn from you and also to share some ideas on Islam. I wouldn't call it modernity. I have a bit of a problem with that, but anyway, I'm not going to pick. I wouldn't mind a little bit of word here and there. So the paper that I've prepared for, I've changed the title a little bit just to reflect my thesis, and that is a discourse, a religious discourse between patterns and unpredictability, jihad in South Africa. When a religious scholar in South Africa, Maulana Musaji, joined ISIS in 2015, he maintained some contact with his family. One letter that he sent to his family from Raqqa became viral when it was published on a website of a satellite Muslim radio station in May 2015. Maulana Musaji is one among a few recruits to radicalism in South Africa, particularly to ISIS, but the only one who has declared his conversion and commitment in this kind of an explicit way. The letter is a plea for jihad written in an autobiographical framework. But the letter was posted on a website and then copied in social media, later attacked in sermons, discussed on radio talk shows, and analyzed in academic journals. Through this kind of exchange, it acquired new meaning. I want to show how it became part of a discourse of jihad, of politics, and of democracy in South Africa. In this exchange, the author was no longer in control of the effect and meaning generated in his letter. I would go one step further and argue that, in fact, no one was in control of the unpredictability of this discourse. I propose in my paper with this example that the semiotic analysis of the letter in its biographical reference can illuminate the patterns, but more importantly also the unpredictability of conversion and commitment to jihad in South Africa. Under the impact of Foucault and a generous push from Talal Asad, we know that discourse and discursive traditions have become the dominant frame of analysis in the study of religions in the last couple of decades. And I think they continue to linger over the material and aesthetic trends that have become a new trend that we heard somewhat this morning as well. I myself have used this frame extensively, and I continue to do so in this presentation, but I would like to use the opportunity to interrogate an application that tends to control or tries to control and predict the meaning of social and religious life and ignores its unpredictability and its creativeness. Back to Musaji's letter, he plots his life into stages, 4 of which are clearly identified by subheadings or short phrases in his letter. The first stage is a change in his extended family to a greater commitment to religious devotion. A sort of a statement about his conversion. This is followed by his journey to India in pursuit of religious education, which is also considered as a kind of a stage or a plot in his life. His return to South Africa is marked as as the next stage. He calls this an awakening to the heretical state of Muslims in the country. Musaji marks a 4th stage around 1990 when the Iraqi invasion took place, quoting him. He became aware of jihad and then openly promotes it among South Africans. At the time, he was proud of calling himself, or considered himself to be a madman, or considered by others to be a madman. The 5th stage, and what he considers his last stage, is moving to Sham, to Syria. In a semiotic gesture of my own, I am adding a fifth stage after his death in ISIS. This is not heaven as he predicted in his letter, but a camp in Jordan, where he is still awaiting the South African democratic government, which he condemned in his many of his writings and his statements, to save him from this kind of death as such. To show the semiotics of the letter, I will elaborate on some of these stages, at least the first, the third, and his last stage. But I'll also keep keeping track of the time. So Musaji identified his first stage as what he called childhood, 1960s. It is a period which marks a major change in his family. He refers to his, and I quote, sparse religious practices, but admits also, and I quote again, that they used to perform regular prayer, salah, and fasting. His family, he says, was surrounded by jahal, ignorance, steeped in a business culture and subservient to a dominant secular system. But he also admits that the family became more religious as religious teachers like him began to return from India and South Africa and added their devotion. He was referring to a particular period in South Africa when this religious devotion, particularly among Muslims and Christians, increased in the context of apartheid. Just to show that it is one part of how this narrative was changed or in responses by people, in his Friday sermon at the Claremont Main Road Mosque, a prominent imam and activist, Dr. Abdul Rashid Umar, subverted Musaji's conversion by drawing on the distinctive thesis of Olivier Roy. Drawing on and citing Roy's work, Umar points to, and I quote, the modern disconnection between the faith communities and the socio-cultural identities which produced alienated youth were then preyed upon by what he calls demagogues. Musaji, for him, was either a demagogue or one of those culturally alienated youth, all quotation marks. According to Umar, supporters of ISIS like Musaji were experiencing a form of cultural alienation by rejecting their families and their religious traditions. He was not turning away from secular culture, as it appears hesitantly in his narrative, but from one steeped in devotion. So this particular thesis of using Olivier Roy's understanding of what was happening in Europe was repeated in a conference organized by Muslim religious leaders in May 2017. In this meeting, speakers celebrated Muslim traditional voices particularly during colonialism and the struggle against apartheid. Umar and others were suggesting from a reading of Olivier Roy that local religious and political cultures were a strong defense against radicalization. Musaji's return to South Africa is marked by him as the third stage in his life. He calls this realization an awakening, during which he was shocked to discover the false beliefs that he and others held, end of quotation. He rails only against the community of Indian Muslims and completely ignores the other Muslims that constitute South African Muslim population. But he focuses on heresy, which he identifies in the Muslim obedience to the state, their total subservience to charismatic teachers from India, which he calls a Buzruk culture, and an affliction by what he calls a virus of something called irja. I'm not going to explain all that. That's a particular heresy that had emerged in early history of Islam that has become very popular among radical groups, or at least radical intellectual discourse, and this is what Musaji was repeating in South Africa. I will show the responses to the first point in his criticism of the state of Islam in the country. Musaji was cynical of Muslim leaders who advocated that the government should be obeyed, and I quote, because they offered us freedom of our religion. A very conservative Muslim radio station in South Africa organized a series of rebuttals to this point in his letter. In one episode, in one of those programs, Maulana Karolia, also a similar religious leader trained in India, offered a learned discourse on key political regimes discussed in the Muslim intellectual tradition, and concluded that there was no reason to reject the secular democratic state of South Africa. He argued that there was a fundamental equivalence between a secular democratic state and a Darul Aman, abode of peace, which the leading Hanafi jurist As-Sarakhsi propounded in the 11th century. And he concluded his talk by citing an eschatological verse, surely the excellent should be recompensed with excellence. Hal jaza'ul ihsani illa al ihsan. This was an apt misquotation that signified a political ethic of mutual rights and obligations from Karolia. The third example that I want to cite, moving to Sham, was a final and what Musaji considered an inevitable stage in his life. He discusses the accusations and myths about ISIS in the media, but he devotes considerable space to the Malhama, what might be called in Christian terms the Armageddon that would unfold in Syria at the end of time. The evil one, Dajjal, was on his way in the end time, he says, and ISIS was preparing believers for his arrival. Musaji focuses on the deceptive promise of the Dajjal. And I quote him, the similar fitna, the trial in Sham and Darul Kufr, the land of infidelity. Externally, Syria looks like hell, full of bombings, killings, unlivable conditions, sicknesses, harsh weather, and a host of other difficulties. Yes, it does look like hell. On the other hand, Darul Kufr, the abode of hell, looks like heaven, with all its comforts, foods, wonderful living, and luxuries. Everyone will opt for Jannah, for heaven. Everyone will opt for Darul Kufr, but know that this is actually your hell. A true believer will opt to migrate against all odds to Sham, to Syria. He will opt for this hell, for indeed it is actually heaven. He's playing around a kind of very popular hadith, a prophetic tradition, which actually presents this kind of aesthetic inversion. But like a vaccine for Musaji, ISIS was inoculating believers against the deception because they don't think this is the final really battle. ISIS was helping believers develop themselves through the trials of violence and mayhem. Muslims should choose this hell of ISIS, which is the true heaven, or which is the preparation for the true heaven. When the true Dajjal comes, when the true evil one comes, they would have learned how to choose the real truth. It is perhaps significant that I do not find any direct or indirect references to eschatology among the interlocutors of Musaji. They were too busy turning the letter into a political ethic for democratic South Africa. Musaji's focus on this aesthetic is more telling, however. In his rendering, ISIS was preparing the followers for this battle between the appearance of heaven and hell. Moreover, the choice that Musaji offers Indian Muslim middle classes in South Africa was closer to their realities. He was pointing to the wealth acquired by Indian Muslims, particularly in democratic South Africa over the last 20 years. According to Musaji, they are deluded by such material bounties that must by their very nature be short-lived. Musaji asked Muslims to rather choose the hell of ISIS. This aesthetic speaks to the heart of democratic in South Africa in a way that his interlocutors were actually missing or ignoring. So using these few examples, I've tried to show that the letter and its responses created new meanings and ideas on jihad, conversion, politics, and democracy. Over the course of 2 years, the letter provided an opportunity for Muslim intellectuals, imams, and politicians to promote a discourse of democracy. Mostly his interlocutors turned Musaji's arguments on their heads. When he declared his conversion, they showed that it was not so. When he claimed that the democratic state was undermining the practice of religion, they showed him its value for Muslims. When he claimed Muslims were clients of the state, they pointed to their active engagement in it. Interestingly, when he said that he was prepared to meet death and what South Africans considered hell, they had very little to say. His call for jihad produced a largely unexpected discourse of democracy that pervades the Muslim establishment in South Africa. There were many gaps in this production, and more serious questions may be leveled at its coherence and sustainability. But I think that a semiotic analysis of this discourse, rooted in how language works in society, provides an example of how an enunciation takes shape in creative, and more particularly what I would like to emphasize, in unexpected ways. I think we have an opportunity to pause on this unpredictability and incompleteness in the social world that seems to have eluded scholars working on the discursive nature of religion in general and in Islam in particular. The discourses of Islam and more generally of religion have been quite popular, as I said earlier, since the 1980s, shaped by Talal Asad in the anthropology of religion, and in the study of religion more generally by somebody who may be familiar to you, Jonathan Z. Smith, but also Rashka and Murphy. In different ways, they have pointed either to the frameworks and practices that enabled religious life in the way that Foucault had done, or the deep structures and problematics that guide the problematics, the agon that Foucault had asked us to look at in terms of looking at discourses. Occasionally, we have some recognition of the unexpected nature of social life that emerge from these deep structures and patterns. But it seems to me that in the nature of discursive analysis, generally to come up with explanations that can predict or at least interpretations that provide some kind of understanding. And both explanations and interpretations provide a certain kind of comfort about the social life that one can understand and one can at least try to comprehend. But perceptive scholars like, I think, Wittgenstein and Hannah Arendt alerted us to the impossibility of predicting particularly what humans may do in their social or cultural life. This creative and unpredictable nature of religiosity, and perhaps more generally social life, has been elusive in the study of discourses. In the way that I've tried to use it in my analysis of this letter, I'm using semiotics to point to such unpredictability and creativity. In semiotics, the central metaphor for religion is not an inner feeling or belonging or even alienation. It is a discursive speech act that is made possible certainly by a pre-given set of signifiers and rules, but which can take an unknown form in their enunciation. A religious act is akin to speech, as we know, made possible by grammar. This tradition of linguistic performance has been popularized by Austen and Searle, but I think takes its inspiration, in my view, takes best illustration by going back to Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein tells us about how to think about the rules that actually govern language, that enable language government, but also help us to think about its actual following or at least production. Let me quote two interesting quotations I hope that you find relevant to. It says, "A rule stands there like a signpost. Does the signpost leave no doubt open about the way I have to go? Does it show which direction I am to take when I have passed it, whether along the road or the footpath or cross-country? But where is it said, which way am I to follow, or whether in the direction of its ringer, or example, in the opposite one?" To make it even more complicated, Wittgenstein continues, "And if there were not one single signpost, but a chain of adjacent ones, or chalk marks on the ground, is there only one way of interpreting them? So I can say the signpost does, after all, leave no room for doubt, or rather, it sometimes leaves for doubt, and sometimes not. And now this is no longer a philosophical proposition, but an empirical one." So I think what Wittgenstein has actually presented to us is that it's quite important to actually pay attention to the discursive, the patterns that I think have been recognized that we can collect and we can identify from one place to another. But when the following of that rule takes place, there's also a possibility of us opening our eyes to the unexpected and actually to the completely new. In the study of religion in general, in Islam in particular, the balance between the patterns and the rules of discourse and their unexpected application has been difficult to maintain. The former has been given much attention in the work of Talal Asad, who has left a brilliant legacy in rejecting previous attempts to make sense of Islam in culturally bounded analytical frameworks produced in academic institutions in the West and then imposed or at least read in the rest of the world. Writing against a history of an anthropology of religion, Asad asked researchers to pay attention to the discursive engagements in the field, to see how people were talking to each other, not just to reading what they looked like or what they sounded like. They ought not to be taken as mute signs that can be read off the surface of the practices. Sorry for that quotation, but it somehow echoes what you were saying earlier. From the surface of what they believed, attitudes, and experiences. Working in a post-colonial vein, Asad was asking anthropologists to listen carefully to the debates, arguments, and frameworks in which the language games of religions, cultures, and traditions were played out. Inspired by his legacy, a number of scholars have worked on such discursive traditions in a variety of contexts. But I think this laudable turn to discourse found it difficult to make sense of innovation and creativity. The unpredictable nature of religious acts was sacrificed in the desire to listen to the other who were or who was not heard before. In the study of religion in general, Jonathan Z. Smith has been more focused on recognizing innovation in religious practices and tradition. He argued that the givenness of the tradition that was extensively studied in religious traditions, particularly in the text, should be supplemented by a recognition of the newness in every act. The student of religion should focus on the interpretive activity between text, canon, and exegesis, where the primary responsibility is, and I quote him again, interpretive and comparative task with an awareness of the understanding of the surrender of that freedom by the communities they study and the rediscovery of that freedom through the community's exercise of ingenuity within their self-imposed limits. Inspired by Smith, Murphy has put forward the idea that every religious actor be regarded as essentially a hermeneut who produces a new meaning through the reading of a canon. This new meaning may be a repetition and a commitment to the canon, but openly or surreptitiously introduces a novelty. So this onerous task of keeping the past and the present in balance has been difficult. Students of religion seem to be constantly caught between a historical approach to discourses that emphasizes context in the form of class, gender, and original religious texts, which are no doubt important, and the desire to show change and transformation in all religious acts. Newness in a purely innovative and unpredictable way is difficult to maintain in a consistency, or possibly difficult to make for us, even in our business of trying to show that we can predict, or at least we can interpret, or that we can understand. If I have a little bit of time, I don't know my time, Henry, do I have a few minutes? Yeah. The case of Islamic radicalism maybe provides a good example of how the unpredictable nature of a letter like Musaji's can so easily be missed. If you follow the main thesis of Olivier Roy, now I'm turning to him not as he was quoted by at least the people in South Africa, but as a scholar who has made a significant contribution to understanding Islamic radicalism, which he says is a result of modernization and immigration in which youth are caught between their past and their present lives. Joining radical movements is a brave show of commitment that belies the anomie and rootlessness that they experience in their daily life. This contextual analysis, developed in the European experience of Islam, turns attention to past experiences that offer an explanation for the actions of modern European, or at least European Muslim radicals. Against Olivier Roy, Gilles Kepel, another prominent scholar of Islam in Europe, of radicalism, turns our attention to the history of radical Islamic thought in the second half of the 20th century. In his view, the cause of radicalization does not lie in the present context of Europe, but the longer history of Islamic thought in the post-colonial context of Arab states like Egypt, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Roy and Kepel are considered to offer very different interpretations of Islamic radicalization for European society, but they offer little insight, I would argue, on the enunciation of radical Muslim signs in Europe, but also in Iran, Syria, Iraq, and indeed in many countries as such. They offer insights on the history of the actions that produce such signs, but less on what the signs are in their linguistic and more particularly semiotic meanings. This historical, backward-looking preoccupation tends to focus on what Smiths called the givenness of a tradition, and not on the freedom and ingenuity that is inherent in every religious discursive act. Those who have followed Tal al-Assad have fared no better. Continuing to carry the post-colonial obligation, they generally focus on the politics of America in particular, and the West in general, that has produced the current wave of radicalization. Rather than the discourse of Muslims, Sama Mahmoud Hershkin, Mamdani, and others point to the discourse of colonialism and neo-colonialism that has spawned radical Islam. Theirs is a critique of the discourse of radical Islam in the public and academic discourses of the West. The signs enunciated by Muslims are left untouched or left to represent an alterity that is impervious to listeners. In my case study, of Musaji's letter, I hope I have shown that a careful approach to the discourse cannot ignore such signs. It is an unfinished project of jihad, politics, and democracy, with the lingering effects of eschatology, wealth accumulation, and the dystopia of South African democracy. The unpredictability of cultural signs should be more openly embraced in our analysis of the social discourses, or social and religious discourses that we study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the genius in the machine who gave me the opportunity to speak after Professor Tayob, because I think that in some ways we have some of the same questions, and I'm going to be talking in some ways about predictability, and the sort of ways in which law requires repetition in order to be predictable, and in its repetition is actually not predictable. So let me begin in 1895. So Prita, this is Abu Bakr of Johor, who was Sultan of the southernmost state of what is now Malaysia, directly to the north of Singapore. He died in 1895, and he is part of the sort of eastern circulation of your photographic economy, right? He gave those portrait photographers a great deal of business, certainly between the 1850s. And when he went to British India in the 1860s and discovered ways in which the Indian princes were presenting themselves and being represented that he thought he would use in order to make himself more legible to British colonials, to colonialism. And then, of course, takes that repertoire and makes it his own in some completely wonderful ways. And so there are many, many photographs and portraits of Abu Bakr, but I didn't realize that that would be interesting to you. So these are the only ones that I have. But this is the time, place, and central character. Abu Bakr of Johor. I'm going to be largely talking about his lifetime and his career, and I hope that it will make sense in a moment why. But we begin with a moment of intersection. 1893, when the Ottoman Majalla, a codification of the jurisprudence of the Hanafi school in matters of contract, torts, and civil procedure, made its way through Abu Bakr of Johor to become one of the state sort of legal regimes of Johor. Followed shortly thereafter in 1895 by the Undang-Undang Tubuh Kerajaan Johor, otherwise known as the first constitution of Johor, also the first constitution in Southeast Asia. And so it's to these two legal moves, one in 1893 and one in 1895, that we, as scholars of modern Southeast Asia, trace the origins of constitutional monarchy across the Malay Peninsula, as well as the language in the current federal constitution of Malaysia on many subjects, including the privileges of the monarch, the religion of the state, and the position of ethnic Malays in that state. And so for me, this project is sort of midstream, is a second book. I wrote my first book and published it last year on the construction of the contemporary category of Islamic law in British India, Malaya, and Egypt. And then towards the end of that project, started to see colonial and local elites popping up in one archive, disappearing, and then showing up in another 30 years later, and trying to think a little bit more in the second project about questions of circulations of law, their materiality, their embodiment, and in particular, some of the incidental ways in which Islam makes its way across time and space. So not scholars and students and texts specifically intent on moving particular visions of Islam, but the ways in which constitutions, business, family, scandal, performance, wealth, and its display also played incredibly important roles, certainly in the moment of Asian constitutionalism at the end of the 1800s, to carry visions of Islam in law that continue to be operative in the world today. And in this, I also think that there are a number of threads that have emerged in other papers and in the conversations we've been having about the porosity of interconnections and the ways in which some of these are Indian Ocean circulations and then cease to be, and then later emerge again, or intersect with Pacific circulations or North Atlantic ones, between Indian Ocean genealogies and inter-Asian imperial networks, but also to think about the ways in which we might, as scholars, disentangle or seek out deeper logics that structure the entanglements themselves. And so for me, law itself acts as an archive of language and the question of translation as an analytic lens for trying to see where these theaters intersect, when they disentangle from each other, and the role that translation plays through that. So 1893, 1895, the Ottoman Majalla makes its way to Southeast Asia, followed very quickly thereafter by the Constitution of Johor, based on a sort of loosely Western model. But when I sought to trace the arrival of these texts, I found journeys going back in time, journeys to Cairo, to Constantinople, to Tokyo, not just in 1893, but in visits by Johor rulers and elites going back to the 1850s and the 1860s. So that's Johor Constitution. Yeah, I'll talk about that in a second. So moments of arrival of documents were quickly beginning to become, for me, journeys and circulations, repeated and retraced for at least 3 decades prior to the moment of constitutional promulgation, and covering not only the Tanzimat Constitution of the Ottomans in 1878, but the Meiji Constitution of the Japanese Empire in 1890, both of which had multiple and complex antecedents of their own. And going back to the 1850s and the 1860s, from which this map, which is the archival work of Project Ottoman Southeast Asia, which is a British Academy project run by Annabel Gallup at the British Library, Andrew Peacock, Michael Fina. This is a map of Southeast Asia sent from Sultan Mansur Shah of Aceh to Sultan Abdul Majid in Constantinople around 1850, based on a kind of reinterpretation of space, which then local elites of Southeast Asia carry with them as they move across the region. And so let me just say, so Abu Bakr himself, his career, charted the progress of a ruler who went from strength to strength by positioning himself within regional and imperial powers as a broker and as a facilitator. So he begins rulership of the state as one elite amongst many in 1862. In 1868, when he comes back from British India after witnessing one of the Delhi Darbars, he has his title changed to Maharaja, and then in 1885 to Sultan. These increments in status were made possible through his role as an intermediary between the British and other Malay elites in the region, but also to his economic and political ties to networks of Chinese commerce in the Straits, to his marriage into multiple networks of imperial power, Malay, Anglo-Dutch, Chinese, and Ottoman, and extensive diplomacy and travel. But his early career, and he's understood in the Malay world at the moment as sort of the founder of modern Johor and as a basic Anglophile and modernizer. But his early career complicates his current image and suggests a number of different sources for his cosmopolitan worldview. For example, in the early 1850s and early into the 1860s, his earliest advisors were Arabs from the Hadramaut. Abdurrahman bin Muhammad al-Zahir al-Saqaf, who dies in 1896, who then goes on to play an instrumental role in the Aceh Revolt. Later, the scholar and reformer Sayyid Abu Bakr bin Shahabuddin, who dies in 1922. And through these and other relationships with prominent Arab families, Abu Bakr draws upon these Hadrami networks for religious, mercantile, and social matters. And of these advisors, al-Zahir becomes one of the earliest and most prominent actors in the region. And he served the new ruler of Johor from 1862 to 1864, before the world travels actually begin in 1866. And he serves as one source of his knowledge of the wider world, and in particular of the world of the Indian Ocean. And so people like Eng Seng Ho and Ulrika Freitag will make the point that it is not the coming of colonialism to Southeast Asia that teaches the lesson of cosmopolitanism, right? It is deep networks of relationship with the Hadramaut, with China, with the Ottomans, and within the region itself that then make colonialism and its cosmopolitanisms, globalisms, and interlocking hierarchies legible to the people in the region. And of course, not just to people in the region. At the end of the 19th century, the issues that Abu Bakr, so this is Abu Bakr of Johor next to his contemporary in Constantinople, Sultan Abdul Hamid II. This is Abu Bakr of Johor next to his contemporary in the UK, George, Duke of Cambridge. See the hats, the medals. Yeah, no, that took longer. I'll talk about that later. And this is Abu Bakr next to his contemporary in Hawaii, David Kalakaua, the last king of Hawaii, who dies in 1894. And Kalakaua of Hawaii, Abu Bakr of Johor, Chulalongkorn of Siam, multiple native princes of the Indian states, to a certain different extent, the Meiji Emperor, all sort of circulate in these multiple intersecting theaters of diplomacy, imperialism, regionalism, and let's call it resistance for now, anti-imperial resistance. And not only met each other, but recognized in each other people facing some of the same basic problems. And so Kalakaua of Hawaii visited Johor on a royal tour around the world that also included the United States, Japan, China, Siam, Burma, India, Egypt, Europe, and the United Kingdom. And he comes to Johor and meets Abu Bakr, and at a state dinner in his honor says to Abu Bakr, "I had not realized before this moment that my people were Asiatic peoples and that I am an Asiatic prince, and that we have much in common in order to sort of resist European imperialism." The same thing starts to happen in Japan when Abu Bakr goes to visit the Meiji, and it is there that the drafting of the Meiji Constitution, which is promulgated in 1890, drawn from the German, the Prussian model, becomes a real possibility for people like Abu Bakr. And it is this constitution and the short-lived Tanzimat Constitution of 1876 that provide different kinds of ways of thinking through questions of sovereignty, of dynastic succession, and of popular consent that make their way into Asian constitutional models into the 1900s. Throughout this period, in law, in diplomacy, and letters, particular lessons were being drawn from the work of comparison, in which dynamics of race, of representation, of theater, of scandal, and of wealth all play a part. And so by the time Abu Bakr arrives in Constantinople, I'll talk about this in a second, the parallels between his particular situation and the general issue of Asian sovereigns facing the threat of European imperialism is reasonably obvious. Right? And law becomes an increasingly important vehicle for the expression not only of indigenous sovereignty, but also of a kind of legibility that will forestall imperial intervention. But law is not the only thing that makes that happen. Right? So in the same moment that he is thinking about the Majalla and the Constitution, he's sending a pavilion to the World's Fair in Chicago, the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, in which the Javanese pavilion is next to the Dutch and the Malay and the Korean. Right? He sends dancing girls, princes, arms, and musical instruments. We can talk about that if you want, but he's invited to, at the same time, appear before the British courts when he is sued for breach of promise by Miss Jenny Mile of Brighton. And the case itself is incredibly interesting, and the scandal that it provokes in the colonial press is incredibly performatively important. But the legal impact of the case resounds to the current moment, because the case, which begins with a simple failure to follow through on a promise to marry, becomes for the British courts a test case for the immunity of foreign sovereigns to British prosecution. And so if you look at WTO cases, if you look at Brazilian and Chinese and Argentinian claims before international tribunals, Mile versus the Sultan of Johor continues to arise precisely for that reason. And so it's not just that this is a case that then establishes a precedent. It is a case whose scandals, sort of performativity, hilarity, and sort of sexual titillation teaches lessons about sovereignty in ways that the case notes themselves don't, right? There's work being done by scandal here. There's work being done by wealth, by representation, by exoticism, by exhibition. But there's also work being done by language. And so I'm coming back from the mobility of these texts to what happens when they land. And what happens to the Majalla is fundamentally different than what happens to the Constitution. Once it arrives in 1893, the Majalla, which in Malay is called the Majalah Ahkam Johor, isn't translated into the vernacular until 1913. So for 20 years after its arrival in a Malay-speaking part of the world that is nominally and in fact Shafi'i, this Hanafi Arabic text sits there as the law on the books in Arabic and doesn't appear to do much at all. And when it is printed in Malay for the first time in 1913, the text begins, I quote, "This book contains discussions of the fiqh rulings emanating from the Sharia of Islam used by the government of Johor in times past in the Arabic language." So what do we make of lack of translation? What do we make of the silences of the law and a sort of delayed chronology in which adoption does not spell realization in any kind of specific way? I want to argue that the lack of translation of the Arabic Majalla on its arrival into Johor helps maintain a sense of unbroken legacy of Sharia from the Caliphate and the center of Muslim empire, while allowing Islamic elites in Johor, such as the Arab muftis appointed by the Sultan, interpretive control over its application. And so by the time it is translated, there is already a sort of reasonably clear hierarchy, pyramidical hierarchy of adjudication, interpretation, enforcement, and vernacularization that is already in place. And the moment at which vernacularization occurs in 1913 is also telling, because Johor is finally about to concede to British pressure for a colonial resident in Johor in 1914. And so there's a way in which the consolidation of Islamic bureaucracies happens immediately before the coming of formal British colonialism to Johor, that again sort of calls into question the sort of time scale that we have in which there's a long leisurely period of Islamic practice followed by an abrupt cut-off, right? That in some ways that long leisurely period accelerates because it sees the coming of colonialism, and then interesting things ensue. For example, the administrative bodies that are elaborated, like the Department of Religion and Education, and increasingly the control of sultans and sovereigns over the language, the texts, and the adjudication of Islamic law in their states. So I want to wrap up with going back to the question of the Constitution. Constitutional scholars tend to think about the arrival of the Constitution in states as a kind of beginning of new ways of governing or a consolidation of a particular kind. But constitutions also spell endings. And there's a way in which the arrival of the Constitution alongside the Majalla spell the ending of an incredibly creative, polyglot, ambivalent, ambiguous, and unpredictable experimentation with the possibilities of law, which we haven't seen since. And so the question that I want to sort of throw into the mix of the conversation has to do a little bit with the ways in which movable models of governance, of authority, of legitimacy, and of rule require a kind of call and response whose institutionalization is uncertain and sometimes governed by unpredictable dynamics, whose ways of inhering themselves in local populations requires a kind of translation into local vernaculars, which may or may not be meaningful at the moment that they happen, and which, despite all of those indeterminacies and unpredictabilities and contingencies, continue to pull very strongly on the politics and the possibilities for current law and adjudication and possibilities of justice into the present moment. So I think I should stop there. Thank you very much.
So the texts that I use for this for this particular occasion are texts that trouble the idea of certain very important religious figures. Although today I will not really talk about the texts because when you do literary text, it's very important that everybody reads the text in order to understand what's going on. So I think my major interest would be to talk about certain issues that the text raises. So I'd like to begin with looking inwards, because interestingly on the panel and also in the morning, we've had discussions on circularities, we've had discussions on how ideas move and spread and how people are constantly shifting and moving, and all these connections are being made, and there's a profusion of it in some ways. My paper is kind of looking inwards. It's drawing, it's kind of tightly pulling inwards, moving inside, and what is happening is with that movement there is a threat of implosion. Currently, India kind of markets itself as a success story in terms of, it's a rising global power, particularly in Asia, and it is democratic, it prides itself on a secular constitution, it projects itself as a very progressive, emancipatory, egalitarian socialist republic, maintains its project of democracy through collaboration, cooperation, and claims popular mandate through collective will. And the leadership that we see is said to be through social consent. What gets hidden in this discourse of modernity, if one may use that term, is the numerous contestations that disrupt it. And the idea of the republic is constantly being contested. There is constant isolation and marginalization of indigenous people who are relentlessly media marked as insurgents or are considered to be really threatening and violent, threatening to the idea of India, and violent because of the ways in which they decide to disrupt this idea of modern India. And they are also a threat to the very capitalist model of development that India has started pursuing very aggressively, which is, in a way, India's idea of being an exemplary modern nation. So disrupting this monolithic assumption of modernity, subaltern struggles and resistance exposes India's, I would say, engagement with exploitative neoliberal capitalist development. Subaltern protests and peasant rebellion, we've seen a lot of that. It reveals the divisive and discriminatory models of citizenship and belonging that is maintained by the politics of exclusion and inclusion. So who gets included as citizens and who are excluded are really, interesting things to talk about. There is a resistance by the indigenous people as well as by a lot of peasant community, resistance towards proletarization. Although today Uday's paper talked about how it was really not a project of proletarization, it seems to me that the government, the modern government, of course, definitely wants that project to take place. And so you see a lot of insertion of the urban into the rural, so you have projects of urbanization, projects of adult literacy, projects of education, projects of bringing them into the civilized world. But their rebellion has kind of ruptured this controlled socio-cultural order of the nation, and through their struggles, what is interesting is it compels us to reimagine India. It compels us to look at India in a way that is not possible if you simply, if you simply are courted by the mass media and you're simply, tempted to believe what the media or what's the discourse in urban India like. Subaltern protests and peasant rebellion against state authority, multinational corporations, land-grabbing ventures, and institutional tolerance of spectacular sexual violence against lower caste women have continued to expose the fault lines of Indian democracy. Combating the discursive production of singular nationalist and colonial history and disrupting it with the hybrid position of practice and negotiation, a number of post-colonial writers like Mahashweta Devi, who you see on the slide, Arundhati Roy, and many others, advance a discourse that seeks to unmask this untold narrative of subaltern resistances, insurgent consciousness, and ambivalences. Their writings collapse the master narrative of capitalist development and calls into question state-sanctioned acts of everyday violence, which is seen, interestingly, as a legitimate, resolute weapon to ensure compliance, subjugation, and marginalization. I mean, good Indian citizens must, of course, appreciate the state's effort to keep India together. This paper then discusses Mahashweta Devi's radical writings, which tell us the stories of subaltern women in India who are caught in this cycle of violence, exploitation, and oppression as body, worker, and object, and are yet able to resist the deep-seated caste prejudices, destabilize the notions of victim and violator, and problematize notions of hegemonic homogeneity that symbolize the idea of India. Her writings particularly show how state power is constitutive of and operated through bureaucracy, how violence is used by the state not only to undermine subjects, but is also deployed to construct them. So I'm just going to look at two stories, but not really talk about the stories in great detail. So on one hand, I'm looking at a story like Draupadi. Mahashweta Devi is one of the most radical, short stories. And the other is known as The Breast Giver. So it's part of this collection which Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak brought into the world and made Mahashweta Devi's writings really, really known. So both the stories are radical. And the first story, Draupadi, is a revisionist text, picks up this figure of Draupadi who is from the epic Mahabharata and rewrites her into subaltern history. The second story, The Breast Giver, is talking about a Brahmin wet nurse who is, in her writings, in the story, a mother by hire. So somebody whose politics of lactation and gestation and reproduction become center stage because she is hired for a very rich household to nurse the babies that are being produced in the household. So she's a mother by hire. And both the stories kind of show how, what is the extent of damage on citizens and what are the challenges that these citizens who are really not citizens can effectively employ or deploy to counter the Indian state's project of violence. So in her short stories, both, Devi appropriates ancient Hindu epics and texts to expose the grammar of violence, of power, and of capital. The sacrality of these material objects functioning as cultural markers of a nation are turned inside out, revealing the hollowness of their claims as repository of absolute truths and universal wisdom. So using the sight of the transgressive female body to represent radical aesthetics, the female body in her writings become a text that gets rewritten through resistance, as notions of the sacred are subverted through Devi's textual politics. So the epic sanctity of Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Purana, which are these really, really important epics in the Hindu pantheon, in Hindu literature, is deflated to incorporate its secular ethics and punctuate national consciousness. So Devi uses incidents and characters from these important ethics and rewrites them in the revisionist mode to tell their stories in the context of contemporary politics. So her activist stance disrupts the universalizing tendency of the narrative and radically reconfigures the idea of the Brahminical sacred. The characters in her stories challenge the limits of the epic and violently expose the fissures and fault lines of the imagined community. Now, Draupadi is an interesting story because here you have the tribal woman who's given the name of Draupadi, who is the queen, and she is, the most important incident in the story is this tribal woman is apprehended by the police. She is suspected to be a Naxalite, so if I can just move on. So she's a tribal woman, maybe one of the many, many tribal communities in India, totally marginalized, indigenous people. She is put center stage. Her name is, of course, this name from the epic, Sanskritized, but here she is apprehended by the police, taken into the police barracks, and gang raped. What happens after her rape is really interesting because she wears her rape on herself, in a way exhibiting the violence that has occurred to her, and refuses at a very interesting point in time in the story when she is called for questioning and the authority tells her that tells the people in the barrack that please get her out. She refuses to wear her sari. She is naked. She parades her violence on her, and she says that you can unclothe me, but you cannot clothe me again. So there is a beautiful line that she uses, but maybe I can show it later, or I can talk about it later. So here you have this kind of radical aesthetics presented in front of you, where you have the most important episode in Mahabharata, which is the disrobing of Draupadi, rewritten. So here there is the idea of shame, and the idea of the victim is completely inverted. So in this story, she rewrites the disrobing and the shaming of Draupadi and shows how the tribal Draupadi, who is brought to the police barracks and gang raped, really is not going to be saved by anybody. The only weapon she has is her own strength. So unlike the epic hero in Draupadi, Devi's Draupadi is no royalty. She's a tribal whose caste and class position makes her utterly vulnerable to violence, and she doesn't have the privilege of protection from powerful benefactors. So if the epic Draupadi was saved by Krishna, Lord Krishna, who had this magical sari which kept wrapping around her, so she couldn't be publicly disrobed. This Draupadi, of course, gets easily raped. And she is assaulted multiple times in the course of one night, and her punishment by law enforcers for transgression is complete. What is interesting is, in this particular episode of rape, she's completely conscious of what's happening. So she's conscious of the acute pain in her body, and she is still able to comprehend the extent of the violence. So refusing to feel shame, she walks out of the tent to the interrogator completely naked. So in the conclusive scene, the brutally raped Draupadi challenges the state representatives, asking them to witness the violence that they have sanctioned. And here she says, and I have the quote, "You asked them to make me up. Don't you want to see how they made me up?" So shaking with an indomitable laughter, and I quote, Draupadi advances menacingly with her black body, wiping the blood on her palm, and in a voice that is as terrifying, sky-splitting, she cries out, "What's the use of clothes? You can strip me, but how can you clothe me again? Are you a man?" So here she challenges the entire system of, entire body of administrators, the government, and everybody else who is complicit in her marginalization. She also goes on to say, "There isn't a man here I should be ashamed of. I will not let you put my cloth on me. What more can you do?" So Draupadi, at the end, becomes this fierce figure of Kali, who of course is terrifying and is a symbol of the terrifying feminine. She's dark, she's blood-stained, and she's disheveled. She's the rupture in one sense that destabilizes the notion of the sacred and profane. So she's both victim as well as violator, She's kind of aggressive, but she's aggressive against the state, which of course has all the powers of aggression. So her image as a Kali figure suggests an alternate mode of self-construction and a radical departure from the essentialized notions of the feminine. So she spits at the administrator. He's of course wearing a white suit, which is very typical of what Indian bureaucrats wear. And there's there's a bloody gob on his suit as soon as she spits. And it's kind of very symbolic because in a way she is marking out the violators very clearly for all of us to see. So if I go to the next story, it's a completely different story, but it's not an act of resistance in this story, but an act of consciousness. In the second story, you have the story of Joshoda, an impoverished Bengali Brahmin wet nurse to the very wealthy Haldar family. And this is just the map of the tribes in India. You can see majorly India is filled with tribal communities, but you really don't get to see them, and they're kind of in the hiding, either in the forests or completely marginalized, or in the cities, anonymous workers. So who are really the Indian tribes? None of us, some of us probably don't even know them and never met them. So I would like to finish by just talking about Joshoda, who is again a figure from the Puranas, the epics. And here her Sanskrit name is kept by Mahashweta Devi. She is a woman who is hired as a wet nurse in 1960s Bengal. Here the question of the woman's body as commodity and as worker become really important. In 1960s Bengal, she is a woman who becomes a professional wet nurse. She earns her livelihood by allowing herself and her produce to be used by the wealthy families. With breasts that were always flowing, she not only nurses 20 of her own, but she also becomes instituted as a mother by hire to the 30 Haldar babies who need suckling. So Devi's Joshoda is an ironic symbol of the idea of Mother India. So you have this constant idea of Mother India being thrown at you. And here what is happening is it becomes ironical because the honorable maternal, for instance, is now completely constituted by the logic of economics. She is no longer the sacred mythical figure of Joshoda, the non-biological mother who raised the holy child, but here she is producer, not really producer, but doesn't own what she produces, but a worker and an object. So critiquing the notion of the woman as a reproducer and the mother as the bearer or nurturer of cultural nationalism, Devi deflates essentialized notion of the ideal woman with the ideal mother through the figure of Joshoda, who nurses healthy offsprings for 25 years, only to find herself to be exhausted of her bountiful resource as she develops breast cancer and later is just left destitute. So her breasts are recognized as a continuous source of nourishment and used by the wealthy landed class as commodity. So Joshoda is recognized in the patriarchal social order only because of her maternal plenitude and through her usefulness to the society as provider and nurturer. However, the repeated use of her body as food finally leaves her destitute. Joshoda's martyrdom at the altar of nation and patriarchy can be read as a critique of gender oppression and class exploitation. Joshoda herself experiences alienation from her breasts. In very interesting ways, she says that my breasts are very important. I don't want them to be messed with. She tells her husband, stay away. They need to be constantly, guarded and protected, and these are my resources. She has that consciousness, and she experiences that alienation, which makes her totally susceptible to the operation of exploitation. She stands for the nationalistic imaginings of ideal mother who sacrifices her life for the nourishment and continuity of the male line or nation. She's given the status of a wet nurse only because she's a Brahmin, so she's upper caste, and yet her death by cancer is brought on through the relentless commercial transactions of her body as commodity. So what is interesting is how the use value of her resource becomes exchange value the moment she's hired as a wet nurse. However, she really has no control over her surplus resources, and hence it leads to no capital accumulation on her part. So if she would have tinned her milk and sold it to the market, that would be different, but she has absolutely no control over what she produces. Her transition from affective labor, because reproduction and nursing is something that women will do as affective labor. But here what happens is, from affective labor, she becomes free labor, involved in productive work, but it interrupts the Marxist critique of the free labor as male or asexual, and it disturbs the national ideological narrative of the sanctity of motherhood by bringing the politics of gestation and lactation into the sphere of the economic. So I want to finish, I mean, there's really a lot to say about Stonodaini, which is breast giver. It's a radical text which fiercely critiques the concept of motherhood and its exploitative potential, which turns figures like her into eternal mothers who basically just get nothing and are completely sucked dry. In a way, it's also an allegory or a parable of modern India, which is being sucked dry by exploitative use of her resources. So probably it's best to finish off with the idea of what's really going to happen in modern India, because here you can see that there is constant exploitation and institutional violence practiced on many subjects who are still not full citizens. But what is interesting is there is a counter-insurgency movement, and it's not just that there's pressure and violence from one side. There is also a pushback from the other side. So the question is, and interestingly, Indian government also used the tribals to become part of the process of cleansing. So certain kinds of tribals were given arms and became a sort of vigilante group for the rest of them. So what I think I should end with is how does Mahashweta Devi really interrupt the national narrative, and how does she problematize the figure of the subaltern, problematize figure of the female subject, and how would literature, in the final analysis, be able to speak to us in a way that any other form would probably not be able to. So photography, for instance, literature, and other ways in which we could mediate into other people's lives and look at alternate stories remain a very, very important project. And we have a writer here in the midst of us, and he would probably say more about what is the real use of literature in times like this when people are not reading, and in times like this when writing anything radical may just land up, put you in jail. So I think I would want to end here because I think it's a disturbing question and I have no answers for it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much all for the presentations. I have a couple of questions. One to Abdulkader about this very fascinating character. What exactly was his impact in South Africa? I mean, you have described in good detail his intellectual trajectory and so on, but did he have followers? Did he have a base in South Africa, or was it just a solitary voice? To Isa, the question of constitutions, that they can mark an ending, not necessarily a beginning. I find that a very fascinating observation, but in the case of Ethiopia, the first constitution, just like this one, was inspired by the Meiji constitution. But it was definitely a beginning, because after that we have had now, I think, 5 constitutions. So why do you say that? I mean, what exactly happened? What was the fate of this constitution that Abu Bakr promulgated?
Various categories like ethnicity, cosmology, gender, lineages, right? And we wanted to foreground the possibility of the imaginative, creative production that these things are that we usually put in these sort of in some ways, simplistic categories. And of course, my own work tries to do that with photography too, that we don't have this reductive sort of reading of them as like performance of a certain identity. But then in my own work, and just also responding to your work, and maybe a little bit also to your wonderful talk, you know, there's also something, of course, sort of like troubling about that move, or something potentially, of course, powerful, very important, but also good, you know, sort of reducing a lived experience or very intense, you know, experiences of violence and, you know, degradation to sort of texts, right, to the discursive, or the aesthetic in my own work, right? So just if you have thought about this, or you have, you know, in some ways your own preliminary ideas about both the, you know, of course the strengths, but also the potential ways that, in some ways, that the discursive can also be, or, you know, focusing on the sort of futurity and creativity of these speech acts, right? You know, how that is both, in some ways, can also be problematic, yeah?
Or fighting against injustice and, you know, stand beside human rights, you know, women rights, against, you know, stand against violence against women and so and so. But my question is that a lot of those people she is writing about, like these poor women or vulnerable women cannot read and write. And how can she make change? Also, the target group cannot read her, cannot understand what is she saying. Yeah, this is my question.
I had a quick observation, which is that even more than Islam, it seemed all the papers were about creativity, improvisation, and unpredictability was the word, right?
And audience.
And audience, yeah. Would you care to respond?
My question stands on its own, so then I'll let you talk to each other as well. So I take your point. I mean, they are, constitutions are both beginnings and endings. But constitutional scholars begin a story with, in 1895, and I think they, in doing so, prioritize the state fiction that looks forward and participate in the erasure that constitutions do of everything that comes before, right? Including the fact that in, for example, 1895, there are 6 or 7 different ideas of what it means to be sovereign that get jammed into this document, after which the only language of sovereignty that is permissible and actionable in any kind of way becomes the ones that make it into the document, and everything else gets left behind, and in some ways, not only left behind, but loses its tradability, currency in the world. So that's what I mean, that that in focusing only on constitutions as beginnings or as consolidations, we prioritize one vision of law and we lose the unpredictable and the repetitive and the improvisational.
Thank you. To answer your question about the disruptive in the works of creative writers, I think it's fascinating because, and I think I'll answer both questions at the same time, because if the question of what is the real value of literature in today's time is asked, then we can repeat ourselves ad nauseum that there is value. And that value is life-changing, because just to give you an example, Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi initiated a process of radical change where a group of women from Manipur, which is under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. This is an area in India, which is in the northeast, very close to other countries like China, Bangladesh, and there is an insurgency movement there, according to the government. It's under the Special Powers Act, so the army can go in and do whatever they like, and they'll not be questioned for it, because they have their own law, and civil laws don't work there. So a group of women who read Draupadi in translation. Thank God for translations. So the story was translated into Manipuri. It was picked up by one of the most famous playwrights who put it on stage. So we are now breaking the boundaries of, literacy and illiteracy. Forget language, it goes even there. So it was staged. The play was performed, seen, and a whole lot of Manipuri women who are mothers, whose children have been taken up by the army and just they have no clue where they are, because once they were taken in by the army, they were lost. Maybe some of them came back, but completely brutalized, and most of them were dead. So these women staged a naked protest. They all took their clothes off, and these were women from age 23, 25 to age 50, 55. They were all mothers. So they took a placard saying, "Indian Army, rape us." And they all went down to the headquarters in naked protest, and there was a direct impact of what Mahashweta Devi's Dopti did, because her protest was naked protest. And interestingly, this is really an interesting irony of facts, that Dalit women, who are the most oppressed and most, at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, are regularly paraded naked as a form of punishment. So whenever they are to be punished in the villages, they are paraded naked. So that's a punitive form of performance that is played on their bodies by people who are in power. And here you have the same naked protest becoming something radical, becoming something powerful. So I cannot say that literature doesn't impact. It does in uncertain ways, in unpredictable ways, and in ways that can completely surprise you. So her books have been translated widely. It has been put on the stage as performance, and when it's as a performance, when you see something being performed, that language is completely different, breaks a lot of boundaries. And so I wouldn't say that it just remains in the library or in conferences. It travels and goes and is in circulation. So that brings us back to the topic of the conference. It moves.
Thank you very much for your questions. I think the first question seems easier, but it's as a, does he have a following? Is there a large following? Yes and no. I mean, it's very difficult to know about these groups as such. So I think just the idea of the letter provided a kind of an instance of, a letter that was written, and later there were also sound messages that he sent around, and his family made that available. I mean, because they were also disturbed, so there was a kind of a debate going on within the family between this person. But then it became also a kind of a broader issue as it was discussed as such. There are other groups as well who, like in the nature of this phenomenon, because they are inspired much more by global flows and global developments as such. But it's once I think the state takes complete control over it, it's sort of very difficult to then see the kind of responses, at least if one compares this maybe with what is going on in France or in other, in Britain, for example. I think the South African state, maybe I should have mentioned, that is particularly keen on not getting involved too directly. They sort of hesitate about, okay, should they declare this a kind of a terrorism? Should they apply the terrorism law? That's a story by itself about how they don't do it. So, I mean, I'm just using a question to actually allude to the kind of question. It's very difficult to answer whether he has a following or not. He himself said he had followers, but they also thought him to be a lot of people thought him to be a madman, during one of the stages as such. So thank you very much for that. I think the other question is also quite interesting. I mean, it's more, as I said, it's, is it problematic? Yes, I think it's problematic, but I think I've been thinking a lot about this. It's problematic only depending on how you think where you are. So that's why I said, I suggested that I want to add my own, gesture. My own stage is actually looking at what is happening to him afterwards, because he declared, in his letter, he sort of almost like gave up his citizenship. But now he is waiting for South African government, democratic government, not any other government, the South African government to find him, because otherwise they might send him somewhere else, for example. But the South African government, in 2 or 3 cases within this family, one of them had initially joined the Taliban, and later this is from the same family and had now joined ISIS. And in the first case, the South African government supported, saved them. But they have been almost the most fierce critics of democracy, which I think is kind of an irony, which I couldn't resist to point out to. But so I think that in a way I'm adding to that, but I'm taking the risk of, how are you adding to that? What do you do to that kind of language? But I'm finding semiotics a kind of a useful way of doing that. So it reminds me of Hannah Arendt's criticism of Immanuel Kant's, the political philosophy of Immanuel Kant. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a book that based on a series of lectures that he gave in New York, which has then been published posthumously. And she writes in there about the whole philosophy of, she doesn't, obviously it's not Kant's philosophy, is as an outsider, as a kind of an observer, through the very revolution that he promoted. The human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights and the French Revolution, that he's always standing outside. So I think that for me, what is interesting for me is that positionality that the social sciences and the writers as such take as a privileged position to watch and to observe, but not to engage in, I think is highly problematic. When I look at Tala Asad, maybe I recommend another interesting text which I think needs to be worked with. I don't think is a solution, but it's an interesting way of putting forward the problem. He's writing in the 1980s a text on translatability. And I think that he is challenging the kind of work that goes on in anthropology before, but I think his solution is equally problematic. And I've seen, after looking at that text more recently, I said, I think that the enunciation, the voices of people that often that we study, including myself, who is a South African who studies, and then you go back into the university and you write about it or you say it, but you don't necessarily take the risk of actually saying that you are part of that discourse. There's always a tendency to prefer, in my case, if I say that, then I'm a theologian, and that's no, you cannot be a theologian. Or if you say it, then you are, then you're just an African or an Asian, representative, then you necessarily become. So I think that the legacy, if I think about it, I think this legacy of the social sciences, particularly through interrogating Kant and the social sciences, and also interrogating the post-colonial voices, might be a little bit of a way of finding a voice as such. And hopefully that might seem destructive, but it is something that I will have to take account for and at least take responsibility for.
Please join me in warmly thanking our panelists, and you've earned your coffee, so let's go.